welcome to this live recording of the Surviving Society podcast. Just a little introduction to Surviving Society if you haven't listened to the show before. Surviving Society is a political podcast produced from a sociological perspective and invites academics, writers and community organisers to reflect on the local and global politics of race and class. We see our work as an example of what we have described as sociological podcasting. In this way, Surviving Society contributes to other forms of creative modes of communicating scholarship and assisted in the kind of knowledge production needed in heightened periods of political calamity. At its core, Surviving Society is part of a vast body of existing scholarship and emerging scholarship, work and art produced to contest the grand narratives which have come to dominate our understandings of society. It is our belief that these forms of knowledge production have the potential to make more legible the interconnections that underpin our most pressing issues. I need to make sure I say this, otherwise George is going to kill me. Please can you, if you have social media, follow us on Twitter, our little Twitter handles here, Instagram, and also our new YouTube channel which launched this week, which has some old content, some new content. Anyway, thank you. So that was such an amazing introduction to Stella, but I'm also going to do another introduction just to introduce what we're going to be talking about today. So Stella is a historian, activist, educator and founding member of OWAAD. Stella is a revolutionary of the Black British feminist movement and a trailblazer of the Black radical tradition in the United Kingdom and beyond. Stella is obviously one of the authors of The Heart of the Race, and more recently, A Kick in the Belly, Women's Slavery. A Kick in the Belly. It's so exciting to have you here. I'm actually really nervous, guys, I'm not going to lie. I think you might be able to tell. It's been a while since we've done an event with so many people, and obviously Stella is an absolute pioneer. So I'm going to get started with our first question, and hopefully be less nervous as we go through. I'm just going to read from the draft constitution of OWAAD from 1978, Stella, and then we're going to talk a bit about this caption here. So, throughout history, Black women have made an equal and significant contribution to the development of our people, the richness of our various cultures, to our resistance against colonial pressure, and to our struggles for national liberation. Black women have been and continue to be strong, resilient and courageous, despite the fact that we are the most oppressed group in any society we live in. Our race, our sex, and our low economic status have placed us at the bottom of the heap in Britain and throughout the world. It was in order to fight against this triple oppression, as we experience it in Britain, that OWAAD was formed. So, Stella, how feasible is it for us to talk about the material and lived experiences of Black women in the way we were able to do in OWAAD and later in The Heart of the Race, in more contemporary Britain? And we're thinking here about the conversations that at times have been hijacked by individualised and neoliberal agendas when it comes to talking about Black women.
Felt like an exam question.
Sorry. I'll relax a bit more as we go into it.
How feasible is it to talk about it? It's definitely still feasible, isn't it? Nothing's changed significantly enough over the last 40 years for us to really relax and say these issues don't affect us anymore. And I think that if we look around the world, we can see that Black women continue to be the most oppressed group in our society and also in others. It's easy to get fooled, isn't it? Because we see the Beyoncés and we see the Meghan Markle, and the other one I was thinking of, Oprah, yes. You know, and good on them, I'm not a hater, but I think what happens is we have fed this diet of rarefied Black achievement, and that feeds into this sense that, okay, then whatever's wrong, it must be you know, because it can't be the society, because look at these people, look at where they've reached. And I think that's quite a dangerous belief, really. You know, what has changed is the way we communicate about these issues and the way we organise around them. And, you know, if you think back to the 70s and 80s, there was no internet. It was a twinkle in some general's eye, wasn't it? Wasn't it the army that developed the internet or something? There was no social media, there was no identity politics, which I see as one of the things that were birthed by the internet, and there was no cancel culture either. So it was a very different context in which we were coming together to address the issues that concerned us. And I suppose the other change is that the state was less effective at co-opting, you know, the messages and the campaigns that concerned us. And by this I mean they were less familiar with the language of anti-racism, the language of Me Too, the language of gay pride. I was in Waitrose the other day, I got the shock of my life. They had this thing, you know, the thing that barriers off your shopping from the next person. They had this thing in rainbow colours saying Waitrose supports gay pride. I'm thinking, well, okay, what does that mean in practice? Basically, it's a marketing ploy, isn't it? It doesn't mean anything. It means jack shit. Can I say that?
Yeah.
You know, even the Tory party, you know, they all know how to market themselves using that kind of language, and I think that's very confusing sometimes, because it makes you think that somehow, well, if the problem hasn't gone away, the people who need to know are dealing with it, when actually those organisations are part of the problem. So I think, you know, we need to stay grounded, we need to stay real, and my starting point is if you live on a housing estate in Hackney, if you survive by, you know, scavenging on some rubbish tip in Lagos, or selling your labour for a pittance in a Bangladeshi workshop, you don't need to think too hard to realise that these women in particular, but not exclusively, are still absolutely at the bottom of the pecking order. So, to answer your question, absolutely, yeah, that constitutional statement, it's quite good, isn't it? It needs to be revived and could be quite a good organising principle, because, you know, in the same way, black feminism sometimes get kind of sidetracked into, you know, how many of us are on the panel, or how visible are we on the media, and I don't know, I'll just ramble a bit,
No,
shall
go on,
I?
yeah.
You know, when you look at feminism, you see an interesting debate between radical feminists and liberal feminists, or what they came to be known as. And I suppose to characterise liberal feminist thought, it's all about, you know, a few more women in the boardroom, a few more women, you know, in positions of power in parliament or whatever. But actually, the real question is, does that impact on the lives of the vast majority of the women? I don't think so. So I would argue that if we think about anti-racism and our struggle to demand race equality and racial justice, then we should be thinking about it in the same way. We shouldn't get sidetracked by the fact that a few, you know, famous faces suggest that, you know, that's fine, everybody can achieve. Actually, achievement isn't what fires my guns, really. It's not achievement, you know, I don't care how many billions somebody's got. What matters to me is, are we bringing up the kinds of women that I've mentioned? Because if not, then we need to rethink where our priorities are. Is that a good enough answer to your question?
Great.
Good.
There's a few things we might come back to shortly, but I think Tesa's got a good question.
Okay.
Thanks, Stella.
Hi everyone. Stella, in thinking that then, how can we get better at meeting people where they're at? And what skills do you think could get us to that place? And where we can both empathise and support each other's learning about society? So I'm thinking here about political education. What steps we can do to kind of educate people better?
And yeah, just to follow up on that, like you mentioned a few things just then when you were talking about council culture and thinking about work that you've done in the past, people that aren't necessarily convinced in the way that maybe a lot of us are in this room about how we think about race, class and colonialism. Like, how do we meet people where they are without being apathetic? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does, yeah. You know, I'm a historian, I think you mentioned that, so I think history is a good place to start when you think about educational traditions and what works and what doesn't. And I'm minded of a trip I did to South Africa in 1994, where everybody was buzzing with this notion that had really kept a lot of anti-apartheid activists going, this notion of each one teach one. Yeah? Each of us has that kind of revolutionary duty, really, to pass on our knowledge, which is why I'm so worried about cancel culture, because I think people should have the right to express their views and express their doubts and to disagree without feeling that they're going to be completely, cancelled out. So anti-apartheid, Black Panthers, there was that kind of driving energy, and it was a kind of individual responsibility that I think many of us felt, that it was our duty to, pass on what knowledge we had and to reason with people and try to get them on board. So I think, a lot of important learning starts in our homes, it starts in our communities. Those of you who are parents will know that, you lay the groundwork, don't you, with your children, and you hope to God that the school ain't going to undo it all, or their peers, or the internet, or whatever else is influencing their thinking. We need to maintain that attitude, I think, if we're to really address what has become a real over-reliance on Google, I know a lot of people who haven't got an O-level biology, but boy, when you talk to them about COVID, you just go, wow, where did they learn all that? They learnt it in sound bites. And so you ask me what are the skills we need. The first one on my list is the ability to fact check. And to me, that goes right back to the classroom. It's those of you who are teachers, teaching your children, your young people, your pupils, however you describe them, to be able to find out things for themselves, to think for themselves, to challenge, to question, to research, to analyse, and not be reliant on other people to kind of fill their empty jug heads with some kind of pre-formed knowledge. So that was one of my thoughts. What else was I going to say? So the ability to fact check, the ability not to get sidetracked and seduced, because I think that's very easy to do in that social media context. And I don't want to have a rant about black young people who don't get vaccinated, because I'm sure those views are not necessarily all shared by you, or indeed, there'll be people who will disagree with me, and that's fine too. But I think it's quite insidious. And somebody I was talking to in the States recently sort of pointed this out to me. They said, this message that had gone out in our community, black young people have bought into in their droves, that you shouldn't get vaccinated, it's a big pharma conspiracy. We know about big pharma, we've been campaigning about that for real. Don't have a problem with them questioning that and saying, hang on, wait a minute, what's this about? But I remember that the first black enslaved man to teach the Americans about inoculation, he was a black man. And, his master made the money out of it, but he was the one who said, those little nicks we do on our children, we're inoculating them against smallpox. And that was actually used in, the Boston epidemic or something, I can't remember the date, to actually, save tens of thousands of lives. Now, any of you, and I suspect looking around the audience, you will get me, you will know in our countries of origin how disease can decimate a community that has no access to healthcare. So that message, don't get vaccinated, don't protect those you love, it could well be, here's a conspiracy theory, could well be coming from some right-wing think tank. We don't know. So I'm not saying it is, don't quote me. What I'm saying is that when we are fed stuff on the internet, which is the first port of call these days for people who are trying to self-educate anyway, we have to be very, very able to fact check, to source it, to find out who's saying what, and to be really clear about the ability to make up your own minds and not to give in to peer pressure and all those other things that can influence our thinking. Okay, what else? Yeah, I think the other skill is the ability to listen and to empathise. The best skill of communication is the ability to shut up and listen. We learn that as parents, don't we? We just have to listen and let people express themselves in the way that feels most comfortable and most appropriate to them. And I think that applies whether you're teaching primary school kids or whether you work in university. I've met some I'm going to say this because I know there's some academics in the audience, I've met some very arrogant academics who kind of think
Really?
that they're the source of all knowledge, and they stride in the room and everybody's got to shut up and listen. And no, that's not learning. That's something else. I don't know what you call it. It's not learning to me. So I think, yeah, people should be able to express their doubts and their fears, and to do that at whatever level they're engaging in the educational process, at any age as well, because we're never too old. Who gets this?
There's a couple of things. I've got a few provocations, I think, Stella, that I'm going to sort of put them out there. It might be that we come back to them at the end, maybe when we're discussing with the audience, but I think a lot of people in the audience are university workers as well. And there's some things that we've been discussing and talking about, particularly with people having the space to talk about how they feel about things, but also so-called cancel culture. And I guess for us, as in academia in particular, it's a very fine line between people being able to start where they are and question things, and also bad faith actors and people that use within our very small world of sociology, for example, people that use that language. Often the people that are actually not getting cancelled and that are sat on Lorraine telling people how hard their experience has been as academics that want to speak out on issues. So I hear what you're saying, and I guess it's a provocation rather than a question, but I think there might be some questions from the audience later about how we grapple with that, because it is a really fine line, and the people that are tending to claim that are the ones that have the most power at the moment.
Yeah, let me just answer. 100% agree.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not talking about free for all.
Yeah.
You know, there have to be boundaries and there have to be ground rules that we all buy into, which is about respect and you know, avoiding certain languages. So I'm not talking about it on that level. I'm saying, you know, if you're in a classroom, if you're an educator, if you're a teacher, the worst thing you can do is make someone feel that they shouldn't ask the question. You know, and obviously as a teacher, your role is to lay down the parameters and to say, you know, within these boundaries. I've worked with some really racist kids in my life, you know, kids who walk in and say, who are you? You know, and I won't quote them because, you know, just the language. But, you know, to be able to reason with that youth, to me, was one of my proudest moments as a teacher. I said, okay, all right, then, let's see you. What is it? You know, and he said, oh, yeah, you know, black people always moaning. If you don't like it, get back to where you came from. And I said, okay. Let's start with where I come from. Do you think I dropped from the planet? Do you think I'm here because I chose to be, because of the weather? You know, and you have that conversation at that level, and slowly you see that youth thinking, okay, maybe she's got a point. You know, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, you know, people who think that they can be racist or homophobic or sexist or whatever else, you know. But when it's a young mind, personally, I'm prepared to give them a bit more leeway, you know, because everybody learns at their own pace, don't they? They don't all know everything at the same time, and some of them have come. I know from the work I did with youth years ago in Bermondsey, this, you know, we were really slated. What are you doing working with working class white youths who are known racist perpetrators? You should be putting your energies into the black community. Well, actually, that work was really important because they were the ones who were setting women's saris alight at bus stops and pelting us with eggs and doing all kinds of other things. And to be able to just engage with those young people at their own level, using their own language, was really, really powerful, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I'm rambling a bit, but that to me is what education is about.
No, I did, and just to be clear, I did know that was your position, but I just wanted to get the grounders to make sure that everyone knew where we were coming from with that. So, what are some of the key similarities and differences you see amongst political movements over the past 40 years? And are there recurring issues you think it's worth us paying closer attention to now? Thinking about, I guess, the left here, quite a common conversation that we have amongst our broad coalitions is that we're fractured, broken. What do you think that's something that's been a recurring issue? Do you see things that are similar to previously? What could be learned from some of these? And again, like when I talk about political movements, it's so broad. It's so broad. But yeah.
Okay, it is a broad question as well, isn't it? I mean, you know, we've only got to look at the shenanigans in recent weeks and months to know that we've got the same very small privileged elite who run things. You know, that ain't changed. That's one of the constants. And I don't know, I'm a child of civil rights. You know, I'm born in the 50s, I grew up through the 60s and 70s, I saw what was happening in America, I saw what was going on here. And certainly, you know, when we look at the murders of people like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, naming women as well, or if we think about our own experience in this country, Mark Duggan, Cynthia Jarrett, Cherry Gross, you know, we can go back and find examples of black people who have been murdered at the hands of the police. And so there again, you know, you've got a constant, a theme that seems to keep coming up, doesn't matter how much we shout or take to the streets to protest, you know. And, you know, closer to home, it's absolutely mind-boggling that a young woman can come into school and be strip-searched. You know, I mean, you know, what bemuses me, having worked in this field for so long, is that, you know, if we were able, some academics should do this, quantify the hours, the person hours, the physical and material resources that have gone into things like the Scarman report and the Verso report and all the recommendations that came out of it and all the hours of staff time where we've sat around tables dotting the I's and crossing the T's on equalities policies, and that still goes on. You know, you just wonder sometimes, like, what is it, 2 steps forward, 1 step back? Now, I don't want to sit here and be negative, because I focus on the 2 steps forward personally, but, you know, it is depressing sometimes and disheartening, certainly for someone in my generation, when you look at these things and think, wow, I thought we'd dealt with this. You know, back in the 80s, we were talking about the same issues. Another glaring similarity that has to be named is the attitude to refugees and migrants. You only got to look at the way you got, and I'm not hating on Ukrainians, don't get me wrong, but the way the Ukrainian population has been welcomed with open arms in this community, and compare that with the experience of somebody from Afghanistan or Syria or Eritrea, you name it, and you can see that the double standards still prevail, and that we're still grappling as a community with really pernicious legislation. And I have to say, I have to name and shame her, because I tell you what, there's a good example of what I was saying before. So yeah, we got Priti Patel. Huh. You know, like, where the arse does she get off? The child of an immigrant. No, I'm going to get up on my soapbox here. Where did she get off doing that? Sending us to, someone should put her on a boat to Rwanda with 1 paddle. I hope this is going on YouTube, because, yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that. But seriously, that immigration legislation, that separation of those of us who are so-called patrials, that was the first law, wasn't it, in '62? If you had a grandmother or a grandfather who was born of approved association with the country, basically if you were from South Africa, Canada, Australia, you were welcome, but the rest of you, you know, stay back. That is still going on to this day, and maybe the people who are experiencing that Fortress Britain mentality are a slightly more diverse demographic. That's very clear. And within that demographic, so you get some pretty white faces, actually, if you think about the Eastern European pre-Brexit discussion about Polish builders and so on. You know, it's kind of all getting a bit blurry around the edges, but the key message seems to me very, very consistent. So, yeah, you asked about the similarities. Differences. One of the key differences that's come to mind for me recently, in the light of all this hoo-ha about the train strikes, is the decimation of the trade union movement. You're talking about the left. I sometimes kind of, when I hear people say the left, I think, well, what does that mean, actually?
Yeah, same, to be honest.
You know, I think Keir Starmer's lost the plot. Lost the plot, I'm sorry. You may not agree with me, I'm not suggesting you should, but personally, you know, I have grown up thinking of myself as someone who's going to stand on the picket line and support the right of workers. And although it's a bit harder to define what working class is, or even to define your own class background sometimes, the power of tens of thousands of working people coming together and saying no, whether that's no, we don't accept this low wage, or no, we will not accept this cargo from a fascist state that is being offloaded on this, whatever, you know, that is powerful. And I think if we had to learn anything from the past, it's that we need to find ways to, if we can't reproduce that, at least, you know, find other ways of bringing people together around those kind of banners. Yeah, I think, you know, there are lots of similarities, there's lots of differences, and, you know, it is incumbent on new generations, younger generations, to pick up the banner, really. And that's not to say that our lot had all the answers, you know, but there's a lot of learning that can be done, both from our mistakes as well as our successes. And, you know, I'm only here today because I really believe passionately that it is incumbent on people from my generation to keep that flag flying and say, right, over to you, over to you. This is what we did. I'm not saying I'm done yet, but, you know, when I think about the energy of a group like this, it's really powerful. You know, organisers are telling me who's come and where you've come from. It's brilliant, you know, and I really do believe in what I said earlier, each one teach one. Go forth, take it back, you know, and if they ain't teaching this stuff in your schools, tell them they ought to be, you know. That's the way we do it, isn't it? That's the way we've always done it.
It's probably maybe a provocation of what you said earlier. I guess one of the differences is neoliberalism, right? So we're dealing with a highly individualized society, a very fractured society. So how do you kind of go about healing this? Because you have so many different pockets, really. Like, how do you go about healing those rifts, the kind of collective action you had maybe in the 70s, 60s? Like,
and also let's not try not to romanticise that as well. I think we spoke about that when you come on the show, Stella, before, thinking about the experiences of women, particularly during those times. Like, sometimes, that romanticisation.
It's more nuanced than that, but in general terms, like.
Thank you. I think that's quite a difficult question, you know.
Boom.
I don't profess to have all the answers, I never have, but I've already said that I think there's a lot to be learned from history. I think I've already said that, you know, well, if I think about my own experience of working with teachers, you can minimise the rifts by teaching things properly, you know, and I'm not naming names, but, you know, what comes to mind is, you know, a teacher who says to her kids, you know, we're going to learn about slavery today, it's Black History Month, White History Year, and we're going to all come in dressed as slaves. She probably would have used the term slave rather than enslaved people, you know. Now, that is not learning in my view. It may be well intentioned, but it's that kind of stuff that creates fracture and dissent. And when I've worked with mixed groups in classrooms, it has always been a principle of mine that if I'm going to talk to young people about enslavement, I don't want my white kids walking out of the classroom feeling like they've been under some kind of guilt trip for the last hour, you know. And the way you do that is by reminding them about gender, reminding them about class, reminding them about the commonalities rather than the differences, so that you don't perpetuate this kind of us and them mentality, you know, where the black kids all go out feeling angry and ready to do battle, and the white kids go out with some kind of guilt trip on their heads. And what was it some young woman said to me today? That's white survivor guilt, isn't it, miss? She said, oh, blimey. Yes, but I don't want to generate that. What I want, you know, I don't want your guilt. I want your activism, I want your support. So if I'm going to do that, then the way to do that is not to alienate people. It's not to just say, you're irrelevant to my struggle, or I'm not having, you know, what was it you were telling me earlier about, you know, young women who wouldn't work with you because you were, it's just, no, that's not the way forward. I don't want a society that is effectively reproducing apartheid. In terms of organising, it's just about really trying to start with the commonalities rather than the differences. And I'm not saying people should be in denial, because we are different and we are diverse, but I do think identity politics, as we've come to understand it, as opposed to the politics of identity, which is a very different thing, yeah? Identity politics can just feed into this kind of, you know, I'm only going to deal with people who look like me or use the same hair product or whatever it is that people are into, you know. The danger there is that if I only speak to people who are like-minded, who believe what I do, then how am I ever going to experience challenge? And how am I ever going to make connection with other people who may have equally useful contributions to make to my own struggle, you know? I'm thinking about, okay, let me think of something quickly off the top of my head. Yeah, you know, the way sometimes you hear Caribbean people, African Caribbean people talk about African people. Come on, get real. You know, that is a classic case of divide and rule. You need to know your history, don't you, if you're not going to feed into that, you know. So, yeah, I guess in a roundabout way, commonalities rather than differences, get rid of the guilt trip and the cancel culture so that people can have a proper discussion and be clear about what you stand for, really, and try to encourage people to join you rather than alienate people because they disagree with you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
because I didn't really understand.
I guess what I'm trying to think of, like, so I think when I see people communicating, especially online, I'm trying to find out people make completely truth claims, right? And you have these kind of polarized arguments, and normally it's anywhere, and you end up researching different things, and you arrive at different truths. And so, how do you go about establishing the truth when you're in these environments? So, I'm thinking particularly online, when people speak, so Twitter, whatever, you know what I mean?
The truth. Even
log off.
Yeah, log off. Even the notion that there's a single truth out there is kind of hard to get your head around sometimes, isn't it? Because, you know, again, as a historian, when I come to any piece of historical research, the first thing I start with is there's going to be different voices, different class interests, different economic standpoints, you know, all those different, that miasma of different viewpoints that feed into our perception of what might have happened. I love that quote. Now, don't ask me who said it because I can't remember, but somebody might know. History is a child's box of letters from which we can make any word we choose. Yeah? Now, I hope that doesn't sound too liberal because I'm not saying that, like, any version goes. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we have to be careful that we don't just sort of believe there's only one single version of whatever it is we're dealing with. And that involves a degree of open-mindedness. And you have to balance that, don't you? Open-mindedness, readiness to learn, to hear new perspectives, but also a kind of grounding in your own sense of what is right and wrong, and what constitutes justice. And I think somewhere between those two polars, you can come up with a reasonable response. I'm not that tech-literate. What's the word? Tech literate. Well, I am, you know. I mean, I can Google and I WhatsApp and all of that. But, you know, I'm not on Twitter and Instagram, and I don't really engage with that. A, because I grew up in a world where I didn't have to. B, because the idea of following somebody or being followed is just bizarre to me. I find it absolutely bizarre. And I don't want to know what you had for breakfast or what you took. I really don't, life's too short. So perhaps I'm not answering your question. You know, I'm mindful of the conversation we had before we came in. We were talking about, what was it, manosphere?
Yeah, the manosphere.
We need to not the manosphere.
No, I'm not going to talk about it. But, no, you know, there's some very powerful voices, aren't there, on the internet, and they're very persuasive. And I think I can only reiterate what I said earlier, which is we need to teach ourselves to be able to fact check, to be able to seek out new voices and not to just be persuaded or seduced by, you know, single issue identity politics.
Yeah, and I mean, if anyone listens to the show, you'll know this is topics we talk about quite a lot, but just to reiterate as well, we've got to think about power here, we've got to think about how much money there is behind the right, particularly that online. Like, I don't know if anyone saw InfoWars this week, like saying about how much they were making like per day in 2018. Anyway, so it's none of it when we're talking about people online arguing, like just making sure that we're not positioning it as any kind of level of equity, and like it's about power and money and capitalism, and yeah, often high level sexism as well. Anyway, we do have some more questions, but I realised at the beginning I was going to say to people if anyone wants to interject / ask questions as we're going through, and I didn't do that, so I'm really sorry. But has anyone got any questions before we get on to the final two? Sorry, George. Should I borrow a mic? Should I just pass the mic? I'm happy to get up and pass the mic. Is that okay? Sorry, we are live podcasting, so I didn't check the tech. Can you introduce yourself as well?
Yes, my name is Deborah. That's all you need to know, really. What you were talking about in terms of, what is truth, it just reminded me of Audrey Lorde saying there's no single struggle because there's no single story, so there's no single truth, there are all sorts of things. But that's not where I'm going with this. I want to ask you, someone who's been involved in the struggle for so very long, in my opinion, one of our leading black feminists.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you how you cope yourself, bring it back to yourself. How do you look after yourself in the struggle? Because the struggle is, we experience it in the mind, or we try to make sense of it in the mind, and we fully experience it in the body. How do you look after Stella in all of this? What's your self-care?
That's a good question.
I quite often get asked this question, and quite often in a historical sense, like, what did you do for self-care when you were in OWAAD? And, we didn't even have that language, we didn't have access to that language, so it's kind of, it's an interesting question, because I'm not sure we even gave much thought about it. We smoked, we did all the things you shouldn't do. Here I am still standing. Some people who did a lot less self-care, they're 6 foot under. So I guess, there's a kind of balance, isn't there, between, being so precious that you won't breathe somebody's air and recognising that you need to stay alive in order to be useful. What do I do for self-care? A lot of people don't know this, but alongside my career as a teacher and as a person who went around the world doing this work, I taught fitness. And part of that was just pure economics. I was a single parent, I had to feed my kid. And do you know what? I used to go to these classes after I had my child, you will try and get your figure back. And I used to look at them and be like, I can do that. She's just prancing around and da-da-da-da. And of course, when I did it, I was humbled because it's not easy. But yeah, I'd throw off my working clothes, I'd stick on my tracksuit and I'd go Tottenham Green. I worked for 10, 20 years, I worked at YMCA in Crouch End, I worked all over North London teaching people fitness. And I'll give you a moment. In the 90s, I worked in Bosnia. I won't go into how, because I actually wanted to be in South Africa, but I got the short straw, so I ended up in Bosnia. And we organised, we didn't have much money, but we organised a study camp for women. And everybody had to bring a skill and we were all sharing it. So one of the things I said is, okay, well, I'll do a bit of fitness with them. I did this class called Wake Up and Stretch, there were these Bosnian ladies sort of knocking on the tent and saying, Stella, we are waiting for you. Anyway, so women arrived from Sarajevo a couple of days into our event, and they were like, absolutely stiff as balls. They'd smuggled their kids out through a tunnel. They'd lived with sniper fire. They were absolutely stressed to the max. And I remember walking into this tent, we were doing this teaching in tent, and thinking, wow, And none of these women had ever learned how to lie on the floor, in the corpse position, take a deep breath, close their eyes, tense up from the bottom and tense back down from the top, and just learn the skill to relax. And I remember sort of 4 days afterwards seeing the physical difference on these women's faces. Still had to go back to the war. But, those small things, the ability to keep yourself fit, taking time out to meditate, to look at the stars, to appreciate nature while it lasts, to love the people around you, to engage, to socialise. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything that, you know, you probably wouldn't say back to me, but that's how I look after me. And I have been asked, have you ever been into therapy? Well, yeah, I've done it a couple of times. I've always gone in with the view, if this don't work in 10 weeks, I'm out of here. I'm not doing the Woody Allen thing, you know. How was your therapy, Mr. Allen? Long. Not doing that. You know, you can deal with this now or I'm out of here. And sometimes it kind of is like a permeation, it's like percolates through, doesn't it? At the time you think, this is a load of rubbish, you want me to punch cushions, but after a while you realise it might have worked. But actually the most powerful therapists in my life have been my women friends. You know, my aunties, my stepmom, my sister, when she and I are talking. You know, all those people around you who make you who you are and who help to define you. I can't really give a better answer than that. I hope it helps.
Thank you. That's a great.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation and for all of your work. My name is Natasha. I have a question about Priti Patel, Kemi Badenoch, other women of colour in public life whose opinions I disagree with. And I feel quite uncomfortable. It's an honest question. I don't want to criticize. I feel quite uncomfortable with some of the discourse around Priti Patel, that, you know, she's an immigrant, so she should know about the lives of immigrants, or she should have compassion for immigrants, and if she doesn't, then she should be on a boat. You know, have they not earned the right to be as racist as white men? How do we understand, like, how do we engage with their opinions that we find racist and problematic and, you know, abuse human rights, while also kind of not holding them to a different standard because they're brown women?
I'm happy to
I
hold
hold
them
them to a different standard because there's a standard I expect of everybody, white or black, immigrant or not. You know, I'm absolutely not going to tiptoe around her because she defines herself as black or, a person of colour or whatever else. No way am I going to tiptoe around it and call it out. As I would if a white colleague came out with that stuff, because how else are we to move forward? You know, I've often had discussions with colleagues in educational contexts where they say, you know, a black colleague of mine said something really outrageous, but I didn't want to say anything because I thought she might think I was racist if I called her out. To me, there's nothing more racist than treating that woman differently because she's black. That is the definition of discrimination. And not calling her out because she's black or because you think she might play the race card or whatever other excuse you might have doesn't really cut it for me. Now, I always preface my comments by saying, you may disagree with me. You may think she's the best thing since sliced bread. Happy for you to hold that position, but don't lay it on me because I disagree, and I will happily discuss with you why I think that as a child of an immigrant, who presumably did grow up with some exposure to the discussions around her family table, she would have more sensitivity and more understanding of what it means to be so desperate that you take your child on a dinghy that is already leaking when you step onto it and risk that journey, only to be told, get out, you're not welcome, you can go to one of the poorest countries in Africa and see if you can survive there. Well, you need to get out of your own country, so no, not having that. So yeah, I hear you, and you know, I'm not a hater. I absolutely, even though I don't always agree with her politics, I would stand up for Diane Abbott, you know, receiving all that hate mail and being at the target, you know. I wouldn't be in any way encouraging that kind of response. I've already made it very clear I don't like cancel culture, I'd rather have a debate with her. But I think we have to be very clear that we have a right, if we see injustice, if we see inequality, if we see wrongdoing, particularly if it's our own people, to have that discussion with them and to call them out if we think that they're doing wrong.
In contemporary Britain, I think I possibly do hold I hold them to a different or higher, different standard, because there's capital to be made amongst people of colour that choose the direction that Priti Patel and Kemi are going in. There's capital, there's money, there's power, Like, so if we start from that basis, then you can see why we're going to carry on getting more and more pretty patels, and it's more and more important to follow the politics that you're talking about here, Stella.
And I'll just add that, a lot of those people got into those positions, not saying because they were black, because I do believe that we should be able to get into those positions because we're good. And she might be very good on some levels, but, that is a consideration, and that's quite often a marketing ploy. Look at what I was saying about the Tory party earlier. Whoever would have thought they'd have a line-up like that? Yeah. Someone from Iran, it's amazing, and I doubt any of them will actually get the position. Because the leadership is not, the people in Parliament, not necessarily the people who are voting in the communities, but it's kind of an interesting turn up for the book. And that means to me, we have to hold them even more to account in a way, because they're there on that ticket, And at some point, and on some levels, they're being asked to represent me, to be my voice. And if she's going to speak on my behalf, she needs to get it right. Don't get me started on the other ones, Kemi.
Yeah, not today. Not today. I know there's going to be more questions.
They're going to go away, so she's an angry black woman.
I know there's probably going to be more questions that we're going to come to. I don't want to run out. What we say on time? We've got about another 10 minutes. I mean, let's get a couple of questions, and we can maybe answer them in a row. But in the first, just before we do that, I think it is important to just come to one of the questions that I did send you beforehand about divesting from party politics, how important that is, and whether that is something that we should be doing. Dyson from Labour.
I never joined any political party because I always had issues with them. But again, I go back to Malcolm X. When he said by any means necessary, he wasn't just talking about taking up a gun. He was actually saying we need to be there at every level. We need to have a voice in every forum. That's my understanding of what he was saying. Anyway, he may disagree. So that means I absolutely acknowledge that we need people who will do that job, who will be politicians, who will stand up, and I'm the generation that saw the first black politicians go into Parliament, people like Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, and, although I had my chance, really, quite a few of the women who came out of OWAAD, because we were like GLC and race equality groups and all that, we would have had that opportunity to take that path had we wanted to, and I think partly because I was a teacher and I love teaching, but partly because I think politics can be quite a dirty game, I chose not to. But I will always acknowledge that those people who are prepared to stick their head above the parapet and do those jobs, enough respect to them. As long as they don't forget where they came from, So no, I wouldn't say to people disengage with it. I think if that's your bag, go for it. If you want to engage with mainstream party politics, well, maybe one of us will rise up and take his place. So that's all good. But having said that, we also need our grassroots community politics, and that's what keeps that other politics real, isn't it? If you've got a good groundswell of ordinary working class people, or people who may not be working class, but whose heart is in the right place, who are supporting the right causes, then nothing can defeat us, really, because that's where the power lays. And my feeling is we need people in both roles, really. But the role of our community activists and our grassroots activists is to, A, raise the issues that concern us, but also ensure that people who claim to represent us are held to account.
More questions? We've got, more questions? Okay, so there's one there. Is there any more? Two. Okay, let's do these one or two.
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Em Wolf. I'm doing my PhD in Leiden. I had two really quick questions. The first is about the distinction between reactionary and radical struggle, to the extent that there is one, fighting for inclusion in the system on its existing terms versus fighting to change the system, how do you navigate that difference or that distinction if you do? And the second one was, you mentioned growing up, or being born in the 50s and growing up in the 60s and 70s. Are there any lessons from that period of struggle that we might have forgotten? Thank you.
Just repeat the first, you said the difference between inclusion and radical.
Inclusion and
reaction.
changing the system.
Yeah. I don't really have an answer to that. I think, you know, if you look at some of the campaigns that are coming out of black radical feminism at the moment, and, you know, I'm thinking about sort of Angela Davis and her abolitionist politics and the growing support for this idea that we need to start again, struggle and start again. I have a lot of sympathy with that argument, I really do, and if I was asked to kind of say, well, which line do you stand on, I probably would agree that we really need to go back to the drawing board, and we're in that perfect storm moment, aren't we, where we really are in a position where we have a moment where we ought to be rethinking and going back and really reassessing what matters. Having said that, we live in the society we live in, and without trying to sound too liberal, you know, that means we're part of it and we need to be constructive in our contribution in whatever way we can. Now, whether that means I'm going to go out there with banners and say, down with all prisons, let's close them, or whether that means I'm going to work in a prison as an educator, working with women who have, you know, had to struggle with illiteracy all their lives, which may be why they're in there in the first place. That's the choice you make, isn't it, as an individual? And I'm not necessarily even suggesting that they're mutually exclusive. I think we have to kind of straddle that line. You know, I'm not wise enough to have the answer, to be honest with you, and I can only speak from my own experience. But as I say, I think if I was challenged, I'd say, I want to be in that prison because I want to engage with those women and have that conversation with them and empower them to have other options in their lives. But I'd also want to maintain the argument that actually what a prison's about, why they're there in the first place, do we really need them, should we be starting at different points, we don't have to incarcerate people. I know I've just sort of focused on that as an example because that was the one that came to head, but does that answer your question? Now remind me what your second one is, because I can only cope with my questions.
Lessons organising in the 16th and 17th.
Lessons learned.
Can you say something about men?
Yes, I can. I can, because actually one of the things that I think if you are looking at what black women achieved, if we talk about the black women's movement, if you could even describe it as that, is that what made us different was that we didn't have that position that some radical white feminists were adopting even back in the day, which is no man in my house, don't want to deal with you, ain't talking to you, nothing to do with you. And, you know, really like, you know, I'm used to women who like, if they had male sons, what other sons can you have? You know, yeah, whatever, you can have others now, can't you? But in those days, it was considered that, you know, they were out of the house at the age of 8, because by then they were turning into young men, and they, you know, what kind of reasoning is that? That made no sense to me. So as black women, one of the things that grounded our politics was the recognition that we were dealing with the interface of race, sex and class, race, gender and class. We couldn't just focus on gender, which is what was traditionally happening in the white women's movement in its embryonic days, and we couldn't turn a blind eye to what was happening to our brothers, sons, husbands, fathers, you know, partners, whatever, in our own communities, which impacted on our lives. So, yes, I will mention men, because you know, the brothers used to come to our conferences and they'd run the bookstall, or they'd do the creche. The brothers who understood what was going on. There were others who said, oh, you're splitting the struggle, and what are women organising, you're just imitating white women. We had all that as well. But, you know, the brothers who got it, they were allies in the sense that we talk about allyship today. And they continue to be allies. And I cannot personally perceive of a world where that wouldn't be the case. That's my view. What else did I learn? I learned about the importance of having an understanding of what's called intersectionality now, you know, the nuance and the difference. Felt that our politics benefited greatly from having an anti-imperialist perspective. In other words, a grounding in the histories and the experiences of the communities from which we hailed, not necessarily from which we were born in, but from which we hailed. And that included an understanding of the absolute power of Pan-Africanism, the absolute power of internationalism, and the absolute power, as I say, and I said before, of focusing on our commonalities. If you think about OWAAD, we started off as the Organisation of Women of Africa and African Descent. And those of you who've been to the BCA, the Black Cultural Archive, you'll see handwritten, I can see mine writing, you know, we crossed out African and we put Asian, because some Asian sister came up to us and she was an East African Asian, so she knew more about Africa than a lot of us. And she said, what about us? You know, we had to do a double take and say, yeah, well, actually, you're right. You might experience racism or sexism in a different way because of your own cultural context or your own upbringing or whatever. But actually, the enemy is the same one. So let's make common cause. And where we can, we'll join hands. And where we can't, we'll agree to differ. Now, that was really powerful. And even people who were against that at the beginning, they kind of got it towards the end. So, yeah, I think without sort of, you know, hogging the whole of the last 10 minutes, those are the key lessons for me.
That's some great ones. Sorry, I need to.
First of all, I want to say a big thank you to the organiser of the conference. I've never heard of this before, but I turned up and it's been fantastic. And thank you, Stella, as well for your insight. And in particular, what I was really encouraged by was your, or what I perceived as you weren't for cancel culture and or deplatforming. Because I was thinking what I've become quite concerned by, I seem to see it from not part of the Sociologies Society, this might be, is that this, if anyone feels upset or feels what we might term as hate, people are cancelled or people are kept from speaking. And I think the danger is quite clear in that you're not hearing other voices. So I was very pleased that you actually said that. So it was great to come here and hear different voices. So my question then is, and that's already, you can probably infer it, is there a place for allowing space to understand the perspectives of people who may differ from us or who are against us, rather than saying, oh, I don't want to hear them, let's cancel them out, and so on and so forth? That's my question.
Before you answer something, can I just ask something, just to make it clear on the question? When you say when people are cancelled, what do you mean exactly, like tangibly? Can you just describe, if you could bullet point, what that actually means for you?
Okay. So what I've seen is that if somebody has a different view from a popular view or a different
and what's a popular view? Sorry, just because
it can be from lots of different topics. It's not just one set topic. And I did think, say for lots of things that happen at universities, where normally universities are places where you hear lots of different perspectives, and people are being cancelled, or people, things are being said, oh, you can't host the year because of this or because of that. I don't think that's healthy in society.
I hear you, and I'm just asking, so you're talking about academics who are banned from speaking in university, just because these conversations are it's really important. Okay, so the question is, what do we do about academics who are not of, you said, popular views?
Popular, yes, or accepted by a certain group or by a certain whatever. It's not just academics, it's something that is quite common in society, even if it's on social media or if it's in university. I just think, I love having people have different perspectives from me. I don't think it's healthy to say because I might be offended, I don't want to hear you. That's why I just want to hear your perspective.
No, I completely hear you. My point about clarity is on our podcast, we have to make sure they're really clear on language and meaning with this stuff because it gets hijacked by the right very easily. Like, because there's quite a lot of things you're talking about.
Thank you.
I can only go back to what I said before, you know. I talked about working with young fascists, really, and the fact that they came out with outrageous stuff, you know. And you know what? I can't speak for everyone, and I'm not, you know, trying to present myself as, you know, broad-backed woman. You know, yeah, it hurts sometimes, and yeah, sometimes people say outrageous things, and you want to just tell them about themselves. But you know, there's nothing more empowering than persuading that person to think differently. So, you know, I think your original question was like, should there be a space to have those kinds of discussions? There has to be a space. I absolutely hear you. And, you know, not only in terms of what you were saying about the right's potential to hijack those discussions, but also the dangers of just having a free-for-all when anyone can say anything and, you know, anything goes. I'm absolutely not advocating that. I always, any time I've ever worked with any group of people, whether adults, police, United Nations or kids on the street, there's always a starting point to that discussion, which is, okay, where's our ground rules here? What is okay? And quite often the way you make people understand that something is unacceptable is you do what you do with your 4-year-old child. You say, how would you feel if someone called you a nasty name? How would you feel if? You know, what if I said this about you? You can have that kind of reasoning with people. Now, I know you were talking about academics, and I think that's a different challenge, actually, isn't it? Because academics have more of a forum and they have more power to enforce their views. But, you know, the only way you challenge views that are unhealthy or unjust or incorrect is by, you know, putting up an opposing argument. And if you just quash that argument, then where's the forum to have that discussion? I don't work in a university, so I don't have any you know, bright ideas about how you negotiate this. I think it is a real challenge, but, you know, I do maintain that there has to be a space within the boundaries of mutual respect to have a discussion that allows people to say, I don't agree with you, or I think this. And for you to be able to say, well, how about thinking about it like this? That's the way, to me, that we've always, you know, brought people on board. And actually my experience of counselling, you know, is that it just puts people on the defensive and just makes them entrenched. So that doesn't actually achieve what you want. But yeah, I mean, I have to say people in the universities are going to have to work that one out, because I know exactly what you're talking about as well. Are you going to ask me about Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, can I?
Yeah.
Just to end on.
Yeah, because I want to say something.
Oh yeah, okay, great. Of course, universities. T, do you want to ask us one?
Yeah, go on. Yeah. Stella, how much energy should be used on convincing people that Black lives do in fact matter?
I like that question.
You like that question?
Thank you.
Yeah, I like that question. How much energy? The same energy we've always brought to that discussion. Black Lives Matter is just a slogan, isn't it? And if you track it back, as I said earlier, you know, the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Cherry Gross, you know, this is nothing new. So we have to continue to put energy into it. But here's the caveat. Which Black Lives Matter? Right? One of the things that really made me uncomfortable during that whole upswell of outrage about the murder of George Floyd, and I'm not any way, you know, hating on that. I was absolutely thrilled to see people of all colours and persuasions taken to the streets in the middle of lockdown, you know, to say no, not in our name. So I'm not arguing against that. I would have some issue about the fact that his name came up in lights, whereas Breonna and the other women who've met similar deaths weren't quite as well known. But it is what it is. When I say which Black lives, though, I'm saying this. Is the murder of a black man on the streets of America does that matter any more than the deaths of, you know, countless black babies from preventable diseases, or the deaths of people who are desperately trying to get across the Mediterranean or the English Channel because they need to get away from war or poverty or, you know, whatever it is that they don't want their children to experience. So my feeling is that if we are going to put our energy into Black Lives Matter, we need to join the dots. Because Black lives ain't only in America, you know. You know, they're not just in America, they're not just on the streets of Britain. They're across this world. And increasingly, we are under siege. You know, if you look at what's happening, you know, climate change. I don't even have to tell you, you know better than I do. The things that are impacting on our lives, the quality of our lives, our possibilities, our potential for the future, they are so crucial that if we don't join up the dots and we only get angry when something happens in our own backyard, we're no better than the people we refer to as NIMBYs. Does that phrase make sense? You know, not in my backyard. You know, it's all right taking up a placard and moaning when something happens on my backyard, but if it happens down the street, I'm not bothered. No. As I said earlier, in OWAAD, one of the things that really made us powerful, and it wasn't long-lived, you know, OWAAD, it only lasted about 5 years, but what made us powerful was always connecting what was happening here with what was happening there. We had that slogan, didn't we? We are here because you were there. We're not here just because we chose to come here. We're here because you were there. You're still there now, you know? And I hope you've all read A Kick in the Belly. If you haven't, please go out. I'm not saying you have to buy it. Go to the library, make sure they get it. You know, it's not about money, it's about reading. But one of the things I say in A Kick in the Belly is, you know, if we know our history, we know that they sold us guns and gin. Yeah? They sold us guns and gin, or exchanged guns and gin for our human resources. They're still doing that to this day now. They may not call it guns, they might call it the arms trade. They may not call it gin, they might call it something else, but that's still going on. And those same African chiefs who sold us down the river 400 years ago are still selling, some of them, their people down the river now. So we need to join the dots across continents. We need to join the dots historically so we learn the lessons. What's the point of learning history if you don't apply it to the now? You know, that's my view. It's not just like, oh, you know, look at me, I'm Lucy Worsley, I know everything about, you know, Henry VIII. I love her. I mean, I'm not in any way putting her down. But you know what I mean? It's not just for the sake of knowing history. What is the point of knowing that history if we don't apply the lessons of that history to our own experience now? So that's what I like to say. I think that, you know, there's a whole new generation of people of all colours, persuasions, backgrounds who are engaged with these issues, and we've only got to look around the hall today to see that. And you know, we have to continue to put our energy into things like Black Lives Matter or whatever works for you, because you can engage with these issues in different ways. You don't have to have that slogan or that placard. But Okay, I'm just being reminded that there is an event at the National Maritime Museum on the 23rd of August. I've been doing some work with them on revolutionary black women, because it's a very white male narrative. Obviously, Maritime Museum is going to be like that, but they're making an effort to change that narrative, and the focus of that day will be on black women freedom fighters. So if you're available and you fancy a trip to Greenwich, you know, come down. We'll be running workshops, keynote speeches, all kinds of things. We'll be reading, and we're going to scatter petals on the Thames and name names. So yeah, it should be fun if you can make it. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I just wanted to say that knowing that people like yourselves are prepared to travel cross country, you know, to engage with these issues in the middle of your holidays and engage in a conversation is actually what gives me hope. So good on you. Good on you. Thank you.